When an entire elementary school bus vanished without a trace in the winter of 1987, the small town of Millfield was forever changed. What began as a routine highway expansion project in 2017 would soon unearth decades-old secrets, proving once again that even the deepest buried truths eventually find their way to the light. The morning air carried a distinct bite as Mike Harmon pulled his weathered pickup truck into the construction site just off Highway 43. The September sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the fleet of excavators and bulldozers that stood like sleeping giants, waiting for their operators to bring them to life. Mike took a final sip from his travel mug, the strong black coffee warming him from the inside out as he mentally prepared for another day overseeing the highway expansion project. At 52, Mike had spent more than half his life working for the Elmwood County Department of Transportation. What had started as a summer job to pay for college had evolved into a career spanning 3 decades. He'd worked his way up from flagman to site supervisor, witnessing the transformation of sleepy county roads into bustling 4-lane highways as the once rural area gradually suburbanized. "Morning, boss," called Darnell Washington, Mike's assistant supervisor, as he approached the truck. A former college football player whose promising athletic career had been cut short by a knee injury, Darnell still carried himself with the confidence of someone used to commanding respect on the field. In the 5 years they'd worked together, Mike had come to rely on Darnell's meticulous attention to detail and natural leadership abilities. "Morning," Mike replied, climbing out of his truck and grabbing his hard hat from the passenger seat. "How's the east section coming along?" "On schedule, believe it or not," Darnell said with a grin. "But Rodriguez wants to talk to you about something they found when they started preliminary digging in Section C7. Mike frowned, mentally mapping the project area. Section C7 was part of the expansion zone, an undeveloped stretch alongside the existing highway where they planned to add 2 additional lanes. What kind of something? Another protected wetland the environmental survey missed? Darnell shook his head. Nothing like that. He said it's some kind of metal object buried. Pretty deep. Probably nothing, but protocol says we need to document and investigate before moving forward. "All right, let's take a look," Mike said, pulling on his work gloves as they began walking toward the eastern edge of the construction site where a small cluster of workers had gathered around one of the excavators. As they approached, Miguel Rodriguez, one of their most experienced heavy equipment operators, stepped forward. His usually jovial expression was replaced by something more somber. "Mike, we hit something about 12 feet down. At first, I thought it might be an old septic tank or something, but—" He gestured toward the freshly dug pit where the morning light revealed a section of what appeared to be rusted yellow metal protruding from the dirt wall of the excavation. Mike's stomach tightened inexplicably as he carefully made his way down the sloped edge of the pit for a closer look. The exposed metal was curved, with flaking yellow paint still visible beneath years of corrosion. Something about the color and shape triggered a distant memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "Have we cleared enough to determine what we're looking?" Mike asked, his voice echoing slightly in the excavated space. Rodriguez shook his head. "We stopped digging as soon as we hit it. Didn't want to damage anything until you had a chance to see it." Mike ran his gloved hand over the exposed metal, brushing away loose dirt to reveal more of the object's surface. As he did, a small section of black lettering became visible. "Wood Co." His blood suddenly ran cold. "Elmwood County," he whispered, completing the partial text. "What was that, boss?" Darnell called from the edge of the pit. Mike looked up, his expression grave. "Get everyone back. I need to make a call." 20 minutes later, Mike sat in his truck, his hands slightly trembling as he hung up the phone. The county sheriff was on his way, along with representatives from the state transportation department. The construction site had been temporarily shut down, Workers gathered in small groups, speculating about the discovery. Darnell rapped gently on the truck's window. "Mind telling me what's going on? The guys are getting antsy." Mike sighed, gesturing for Darnell to get in the passenger seat. As his assistant settled in, Mike stared straight ahead at the idle excavators. "You're too young to remember this," Mike began, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil brewing inside him. "But back in 1987, an elementary school bus went missing, disappeared without a trace during a winter storm. Driver, 12 kids, all gone. I was 22 then, just starting out with the department." Darnell's eyes widened. "And you think that's—" "Elmwood County School District," Mike confirmed. "That's what the lettering on the side says. The sheriff needs to get here before we uncover any more of it." "Jesus," Darnell breathed. "After all this time right here under the highway?" Mike nodded, memories flooding back from that terrible winter 30 years ago. The frantic search parties combing through snow-covered fields, the desperate parents holding vigil at the elementary school, the gradual, heartbreaking transition from rescue mission to recovery operation, and finally, to unsolved mystery. "I knew some of those families," Mike said quietly. "My sister's boy, Nathan, was in the same grade. He was supposed to be on that bus that day, but he stayed home sick. The Millers lived next door to us. Their daughter Emma was one of the missing kids." Darnell remained respectfully silent, allowing Mike the space to process his thoughts. "For years, there were theories," Mike continued. "Some thought the driver, Walter Briggs, had kidnapped the children. Others believed they'd driven into Carver Lake and that the bus would eventually be found in the deepest part where recovery teams couldn't reach. There were even rumors about alien abductions or government conspiracies." He gestured toward the excavation site. "But nobody, not once in 30 years, ever suggested they were right here, buried beside the highway." The wail of approaching sirens cut through the morning air, announcing the arrival of law enforcement. Mike straightened his shoulders, preparing to meet them and explain the situation. As a Millfield native who had lived through the original disappearance, he felt a strange sense of responsibility as the one who had discovered the truth after all these years. Sheriff Carson Brewer was the first to approach, his weathered face grave beneath the brim of his department-issued hat. Unlike most of the deputies who accompanied him, Carson was old enough to remember the original case. He had been a rookie officer during the 1987 disappearance. "Mike," he greeted solemnly, extending his hand. "Your call said you might have found—" "The Elmwood bus," Mike nodded. "We've only uncovered a small section, but the coloring and lettering match. It's buried about 12 feet down in section C7. The sheriff's expression remained professional, but Mike could see the emotional impact of the news in the slight tightening around his eyes. "Show me." Together they walked to the excavation site, now cordoned off with yellow caution tape. Carson stared down at the exposed metal for a long moment before turning to one of his deputies. "Call the state forensics team," he instructed, "and get Judge Harmon on the phone. We'll need an expedited warrant to proceed with recovery. This is now a potential crime scene." As the deputy moved away to make the calls, Carson turned back to Mike. "We'll need to take over the site. Your crew will have to stand down while we bring in specialists." "Of course," Mike agreed immediately. "Whatever you need, we can shift our teams to other sections of the project in the meantime." Carson nodded appreciatively. "I remember that winter," he said quietly, his gaze returning to the partially exposed bus. "Second month on the job, we searched for weeks. I was part of the dive team that checked Carver Lake 3 times over." "I volunteered for the ground search," Mike replied. "Felt like the whole town was out there looking." "It nearly tore Millfield apart," Carson acknowledged. "The accusations, the suspicion. Walter Briggs's wife had to move away. People were so sure he'd done something with those kids." Mike nodded, remembering the tension that had gripped there. Community. The bus driver's wife, Ellen Briggs, had endured months of harassment before finally leaving town, despite there being no evidence that her husband was responsible for the disappearance. "Do you think we'll finally get answers?" Mike asked, gesturing toward the buried vehicle. Carson's expression was guarded. "Maybe, but after 30 years. He left the sentence unfinished, both men understanding the grim implications. By midday, the construction site had been transformed into a hive of law enforcement activity. State police had established a perimeter, and forensic anthropologists from the state university were preparing for the delicate excavation process. News crews had begun to gather at the police barricade, word of the discovery spreading quickly through local channels. Mike had sent most of his crew home for the day, keeping only essential personnel on site to assist authorities if needed. He found himself unable to leave, drawn by both professional responsibility and personal connection to the unfolding events. As he watched the specialists prepare their equipment, a silver sedan pulled up to the police checkpoint. After a brief conversation with the officers, the car was allowed through. It parked near the command center that had been hastily erected, and a woman in her mid-60s emerged, her silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. Mike recognized her immediately, despite the decades that had passed. Margaret Miller had been his neighbor for 15 years before moving to a smaller house across town after her husband's death. Her daughter Emma had been one of the children on the missing bus. Without thinking, Mike approached her. "Mrs. Miller?" Margaret turned, confusion briefly crossing her face before recognition dawned. "Mike Harmon, it's been some time." "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "I'm sorry about the circumstances." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the excavation site. "They called me. Said you found the bus." Her voice was steady, but Mike could see the cost of that control in the tight set of her shoulders. "We think so," Mike confirmed gently. "They're just beginning the recovery process now." Margaret took a deep breath. 30 years I've been waiting, in for a phone call about my Emma. Imagined it 1,000 different ways. Never thought it would be like this, though. "Mrs. Miller, Margaret, you don't have to stay for this part," Mike suggested carefully. "The process could take days, and it might be difficult." She finished for him with a sad smile. "My daughter has been missing for 3 decades, Mike. There's nothing more difficult than that uncertainty. I need to be here." Mike nodded, understanding her determination. "Of course. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be nice," she admitted. "Black, if possible." As Mike walked to the site's mobile canteen to fetch the coffee, he noticed more vehicles arriving. At the checkpoint, word was spreading among the families of the missing children, drawn by the possibility of finally learning what had happened to their loved ones. By the time he returned with Margaret's coffee, Sheriff Carson was addressing a small group of people. Family, members of the victims, Mike realized. Their faces showed various stages of shock, grief, and desperate hope. Some were holding each other, while others stood apart, as if bracing themselves against whatever news might come. "I know you all have questions," Carson was saying, his tone gentle but firm. "Right now we don't have many answers. We've confirmed that we've located what appears to be a school bus buried at this site. Based on the visible markings, we believe it may be the bus that disappeared in 1987, but we won't know for certain until the recovery is complete." A middle-aged man stepped forward. "When will you know more?" "The excavation team is preparing to begin work now," Carson explained. "It's a delicate process that could take several days. We need to preserve any potential evidence." "Evidence?" A woman's voice rose anxiously from the back of the group. "You think this was a crime?" Carson chose his words carefully. "At this point, we're treating the site as a potential crime scene, which is standard procedure in cases like this. We don't want to speculate about what happened until we have more information." As the sheriff continued addressing questions, Mike handed Margaret her coffee. She accepted it with a small nod of thanks, her attention fixed on the activity around the excavation site, where specialists were now setting up equipment to carefully remove the earth surrounding the bus. "I always knew she was gone," Margaret said softly, almost to herself. "A mother knows. But there was always this tiny part of me that hoped that maybe there was some explanation, some reason they all disappeared that didn't end with—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Mike stood beside her in respectful silence, unsure what comfort he could possibly offer in the face of such grief. His own memories of that time were resurfacing, the confusion, the fear that had gripped the community, the way parents had suddenly become protective of their children to the point of paranoia. "Nathan still has nightmares sometimes," he found himself saying. "My nephew, the boy who stayed home sick that day, survivor's guilt, the therapist calls it." Margaret nodded. "I've met others over the years, parents whose children missed the bus that morning or were home sick. They all carry it with them in different ways." As they watched the methodical preparations of the recovery team, Mike was struck by the strange symmetry of the moment. 30 years ago, he had been part of the desperate search for the missing bus. Now, he was here at its discovery, bearing witness to whatever secrets it had kept buried for all these decades. The afternoon progressed with painstaking slowness as the forensic team worked to carefully expose more of the buried vehicle. By late afternoon, they had uncovered enough to confirm beyond doubt that it was indeed a school bus, and specifically the one that had vanished in 1987. The faded but still visible identification number matched the records of the missing vehicle. News crews now lined the perimeter of the site, their satellite vans parked along the highway shoulder. The story was spreading beyond local stations, picked up by national networks drawn to the mystery of a 30-year-old disappearance potentially solved by chance. As shadows lengthened across the construction site, Dr. Eleanor Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist, approached the waiting families and officials. Her expression was professional, yet compassionate, as she prepared to deliver her preliminary findings. "We've successfully exposed approximately 40% of the vehicle," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere. "The bus appears to be largely intact, though there is significant structural damage to the front end, consistent with a high-impact collision." A collective murmur passed through the gathered families. "We've also confirmed that there are human remains inside the vehicle," Dr. Chen continued carefully. "At this stage, I cannot speculate on numbers or condition, but we are proceeding with the utmost care to preserve all evidence." Margaret's hand found Mike's arm, gripping it tightly as the confirmation of deaths washed over the group. Some began to weep openly, while others stood in stunned silence, the finality of the news landing with crushing weight after decades of uncertainty. The second day of excavation dawned with an oppressive September heat that seemed at odds with the somber mood enveloping the site. Mike arrived just after sunrise, having slept poorly, his mind churning with questions about how a school bus could have remained hidden under the highway for 3 decades. He found the scene transformed from the previous evening. Large floodlights now surrounded the excavation area, indicating the forensic team had worked through the night. A series of white tents had been erected nearby, and a steady stream of officials moved between them with purpose. Dr. Chen met him at the police checkpoint, her face showing signs of exhaustion beneath her professional demeanor. "Mr. Harmon, good morning. Sheriff Carson mentioned you might be returning." "Couldn't stay away," Mike admitted. "Has there been progress?" Dr. Chen nodded, gesturing for him to follow her toward the command tent. "Significant. We've exposed approximately 70% of the vehicle now, Based on our findings, we're developing a preliminary timeline of events. Inside the tent, large monitors displayed images of the partially excavated bus. Digital mapping had created a three-dimensional model showing its position beneath the highway layers. Mike was struck by how precise the work was, a far cry from the construction methods of the late 1980s when the highway had been expanded. Sheriff Carson looked up from where he was conferring with two state police officers. "Mike, glad you're here. Your historical knowledge of the area might be useful." "Happy to help however I can," Mike replied, his gaze drawn to the monitor screens. The images showed the bus at an angle, its front end significantly damaged, as if it had plunged down an embankment before coming to rest. Dr. Chen took over the briefing, her voice steady and clinical. "Based on our analysis so far, it appears the bus left the roadway at high speed, traveling down what would have been an embankment alongside the old county road. The impact caused catastrophic damage to the front section, including the driver's area." She clicked to display another image, this one showing the layers of soil and material above the bus. What's particularly noteworthy is that the bus wasn't simply buried by natural soil accumulation. There are distinct layers of industrial fill material consistent with major road construction directly above the vehicle. The implication hung heavy in the air. Mike found his throat suddenly dry. "The highway expansion project." Carson nodded grimly. "That's what we're looking at. The timeline fits too perfectly to be coincidence. The bus disappeared in December 1987. The highway expansion began in April 1988, completed by November that same year. Are you suggesting the construction crews buried the bus?" Mike asked, the question bringing into focus the horrific possibility that had been forming in his mind since yesterday. "We need to consider all possibilities," Dr. Chen replied carefully, "including that scenario. The positioning and layering suggest the bus was not moved after the accident. It was simply built." "Over." Mike felt ill. "That's not possible. I was working for the department back then, junior position, but still. There would have been surveys, environmental assessments. Something this big wouldn't have been missed." "Unless it wasn't an accident," Carson said quietly. "We've pulled the original construction records. The site supervisor was Harold Jennings. Name ring a bell?" Mike nodded slowly. "Old Harry. Retired about 15 years ago. Died maybe 5-6 years back from cancer." "Convenient," remarked one of the state officers, earning a sharp look from Carson. "We're not jumping to conclusions," the sheriff cautioned, "but we are going to interview everyone still living who was involved with that construction project. Mike, I'll need a list of names. Anyone you can remember who worked on this section." Mike nodded, mentally cataloging former colleagues. "I can put that together for you." "There's something else," Dr. Chen said, turning to another screen. This one showed a close-up of what appeared to be the bus's rear emergency exit door. "We found tool marks on the emergency exit, consistent with someone attempting to open it from the outside. And inside the bus, several of the children appear to have moved toward the back, away from the impact zone." The implications were clear and horrifying. Some of the children had survived the initial crash. Someone had tried to get the door open. "So they didn't all die instantly," Mike whispered, the weight of this revelation settling like a stone in his chest. "The evidence suggests at least some survived the impact," Dr. Chen confirmed. "We won't know the full story until we complete the excavation and can examine everything properly." As Mike absorbed this devastating information, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the tent's opening, they could see several reporters attempting to push past the police barricade, cameras raised. "Damn it," Carson muttered. "Someone leaked details to the press." He gestured to his deputies to reinforce the perimeter before turning back to Mike. "We need to get ahead of this. The families will be arriving soon for this morning's briefing. They should hear this from us, not from some sensationalized news report." For the next hour, the officials prepared for the difficult task of updating the families of the victims. Mike used the time to compile a list of former construction workers, grateful for the simple, practical task that kept his mind momentarily distracted from the horror of what they were uncovering. By mid-morning, the family waiting area was filled, with people from across multiple generations, parents now in their 60s and 70s, siblings of the missing children now middle-aged, and even some grandchildren who had grown up in the shadow of the tragedy without ever knowing the missing family members. Margaret Miller sat near the front, composed but visibly tense. Next to her was a man in his late 30s who Mike recognized as Thomas, her son, who had been just a small child when his sister disappeared. Thomas had his arm protectively around an elderly man whom Mike didn't immediately recognize. As Carson and Dr. Chen prepared to address the group, Margaret caught Mike's eye and beckoned him over. "Mike, you remember Emma's father, Robert?" she said, gesturing to the elderly man beside her. Mike was momentarily taken aback. Robert Miller had aged dramatically from the strong, middle-aged man Mike remembered from 30 years ago. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a frail shell. "Of course," Mike said, extending his hand. "Mr. Miller, it's been a long time." Robert Miller's grip was surprisingly firm, his eyes clear despite his fragile appearance. "They told me Emma's been found," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "After all these years of not knowing, thinking maybe she was out there somewhere." His voice broke, and Thomas tightened his arm around his father's shoulders. Mike felt a surge of sympathy. For the family, the discovery was forcing them to confront grief they had likely never fully processed. "The sheriff's about to provide an update," Mike said gently. "They've made a lot of progress overnight." As if on cue, Sheriff Carson stepped forward, bringing the murmured conversations to a halt. His expression was solemn as he surveyed the gathered families. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is an incredibly difficult time," he began. "We've made significant progress in the recovery effort, and Dr. Chen will share the technical details shortly. But first, I want to prepare you for some of what we've found." Carson paused, gathering his thoughts. "It appears that the bus left the road during the winter storm, suffering a serious collision. Based on the evidence, we believe that what happened next was not an accident, but a deliberate attempt to conceal the crash site during the highway expansion project that began a few months later." A collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by exclamations of shock and anger. "You're saying someone covered up the crash deliberately?" A middle-aged woman near the back stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "Someone knew where our children were this whole time?" Carson raised a hand, attempting to maintain order. "We are still gathering evidence, but yes, that is our current working theory. We believe individuals involved in the highway construction and project either discovered the bus after the accident or potentially were aware of it from the beginning and made a decision to continue construction over the site." The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, grief, outrage, disbelief, all mingling together. Mike watched as the magnitude of this betrayal washed over the families. They had spent decades assuming their loved ones had been lost to an accident or had been taken far away. The idea that they had been less than 5 miles from town the entire time, that people in their own community might have been complicit in concealing the truth, was almost too much to bear. As Carson struggled to regain control of the meeting, Mike noticed Robert Miller slowly rising to his feet. Despite his age and frailty, there was a commanding presence about him that gradually silenced the room. "I want to see her," he said, his voice stronger now, carrying clearly across the hushed space. "I want to see where my daughter has been all these years." The request was simple, human, and impossible to deny. Carson looked to Dr. Chen, who nodded slightly. "We can arrange for family members to view the recovery site," she confirmed. Though I must caution that the actual removal of remains hasn't yet begun. What you would see is the vehicle itself." "That's enough," Robert said firmly. "We've waited 30 years. We won't wait any longer." His words seemed to galvanize the other families, who voiced similar requests. Within the hour, a plan was implemented to allow small groups of family members to approach the edge of the excavation site under escort. Mike found himself accompanying the Millers, Margaret, Robert, and Thomas, along with Dr. Chen. As they approached the site, the full scale of the operation became apparent. The bus was now almost completely exposed, its once bright yellow paint faded and corrupted by decades underground. The front section was crumpled, the impact having compressed the driver's area significantly. The windows were mostly intact, but opaque with grime, mercifully obscuring the interior from casual view. Robert Miller stood at the edge of the excavation, his weathered face a mask of grief as he gazed down at the vehicle that had taken his daughter. For a long moment no one spoke, the enormity of the moment rendering words inadequate. "She was wearing a red coat that day," Robert finally said, his voice barely audible. "Brand new, her Christmas present from us. She was so excited to wear it to school, even though it was too big for her. Said she'd grow into it." Margaret moved closer to her ex-husband, taking his hand in hers. Their shared loss had transcended their separation, bringing them together in this moment of painful closure. "We used to drive this road every day," Thomas said, shaking his head in disbelief. "All these years, and she was right here." As the Millers stood in silent contemplation, Mike's attention was drawn to activity near the command tent. A state police cruiser had arrived, and officers were escorting an elderly man toward the tent. Though stooped with age, there was something familiar about his walk, the set of his shoulders. "Frank Osborne," Mike murmured in recognition. "You know him?" Dr. Chen asked quietly. Mike nodded. He was the assistant project manager on the highway expansion, worked directly under Harry Jennings, must be in his 80s now. Dr. Chen's gaze sharpened with professional interest. "One of the people who might have known I should go," Mike said, suddenly feeling intrusive in the Millers' moment of grief. "They'll want to interview me about the construction crew as well." He approached the family, offering his condolences once more. "I need to help with the investigation," he explained, "but I'll be nearby if you need anything." Margaret squeezed his arm gratefully. "Thank you, Mike, for everything." As Mike made his way back to the command tent, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a fine line between investigator and potentially complicit party. He had been part of the department during the highway construction, even if he'd been too junior to have any decision-making authority. The questions haunting him now were the same ones likely racing through the minds of the investigators. Who knew about the bus? How many people were involved in the cover-up, and why would anyone make such a horrific decision? Inside the command tent, Frank Osborne sat at a folding table, a cup of untouched coffee before him. His roomy eyes widened in recognition as Mike entered. "Mike Harmon," he said, his voice raspy with age. "They told me you found it." Mike nodded, taking a seat across from him. "By accident, we're expanding the highway again." A bitter smile crossed Frank's weathered face. "History repeating itself." "Mr. Osborne," Carson began formally, "we've asked you here to help us understand what happened during the 1988 highway expansion project. Specifically, we need to know if you or anyone else on the construction crew was aware of the bus's presence." Frank stared down at his gnarled hands, silent for so long that Mike wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We all knew," he said. "Not at first, but once the preliminary grading started, there was no missing it. A piece of the roof was sticking up through the snow when the thaw began." Mike felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. The confirmation of his worst fears hit him with physical force. "You knew there was a school bus there, The same bus that had been missing for months with children aboard, and you just built over it. Carson's voice held carefully controlled outrage. Frank's eyes, when he raised them, were filled with a lifetime of regret. It wasn't that simple. By the time we found it, the decision wasn't ours to make. Whose decision was? It, Carson pressed. County Commissioner Morris had the final say, Frank replied. Said the project was too important, too much money at stake. The federal funding would disappear if we delayed construction to deal with what we found. Commissioner Thomas Morris? Mike asked incredulously. He knew? Frank nodded wearily. He came to the site himself when Harry called him. Took one look and said it was clearly too late to help anyone inside. Said the smart play was to finish the job, keep quiet, and let everyone believe the bus was still missing. And you all just went along with it. Carson's disgust was palpable. You don't understand what it was like, Frank said defensively. The county was desperate for that highway funding. The recession had hit us hard. Morris made it clear. Anyone who talked would not only lose their job, but would face criminal charges for interference with a federal project. So instead you participated in concealing evidence in the deaths of 13 people, Carson counted. 12 of them children. Frank's face crumpled. We told ourselves they were already gone, that there was nothing we could do for them anymore. Some of the men quit anyway, couldn't live with it. Others drank themselves numb. Harry never forgave. Himself died still carrying that secret. As Frank continued his confession, describing in halting detail how the construction had proceeded around and then over the crash site, Mike felt a growing sense of betrayal. Not just for the families who had been denied closure for 30 years, but for the community that had been built on this terrible lie. Thomas Morris is still alive, Mike realized aloud. He must be 90 by now, but last I heard, he was living in that big house on Lakeview Drive. Carson exchanged glances with the state officers. We'll need to speak with him immediately. As preparations were made to interview the former commissioner, Mike stepped outside the tent, needing a moment to process what he'd learned. The site was now buzzing with activity. Forensic teams carefully documenting every aspect of the scene, officers interviewing former construction workers who had been called in, reporters gathering at the perimeter, sensing a breaking story. Among the chaos, Mike spotted Margaret Miller standing alone. The sprawling Victorian mansion on Lakeview Drive had once been the crown jewel of Millfield's historic district. Now, with its peeling paint and overgrown gardens, it stood as a faded monument to former prestige. As Mike pulled up behind the police cruisers already lining the circular driveway, he couldn't help but note the symbolism. Like the house, Thomas Morris's carefully constructed legacy was crumbling before their eyes. Sheriff Carson met him at the front steps, his expression grim. Morris's health aide tried to claim he was too ill for questioning. Judge Harmon overruled that objection and granted us 2 hours with medical personnel present. Mike nodded, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. Has he said anything? Yet, nothing substantive. Claims his memory isn't what it used to be. Carson's tone made it clear he wasn't buying the convenient lapse. We've set up in the study, state prosecutors already inside. The interior of the house retained vestiges of its former grandeur, ornate woodwork, crystal chandeliers, antique furniture arranged precisely in rooms designed for entertaining political allies and business associates. Family photos lined the hallway, chronicling the rise of Thomas Morris from ambitious young attorney to powerful county commissioner. In many, he stood alongside governors, senators, even a president, the architect of Millfield's transformation from struggling rural community to prosperous suburb. What those photographs didn't show, Mike thought bitterly, was the price of that transformation. 12 children and their driver, buried beneath progress, their families left to decades of agonizing uncertainty. The study door stood ajar, voices filtering out into the hallway. Mike recognized the measured tones of District Attorney Eleanor. Winters, a formidable prosecutor whose reputation for methodical, relentless questioning had broken hardened criminals. "Mr. Morris, I'll ask you again," she was saying as Mike and Carson entered. "When did you first become aware that the missing school bus had been located during the highway expansion project?" Thomas Morris sat in a high-backed leather chair, a plaid blanket draped across his legs despite the warmth of the room. At 92, he retained the aristocratic bearing that had been his trademark during his years in office, though time had considerably diminished his once imposing physical presence. A home health aide hovered nearby, monitoring equipment that displayed his vital signs, while an oxygen tank stood ready beside his chair. Morris's rheumy eyes shifted to the newcomers, recognition flashing briefly before his gaze settled on Mike. "Harmon," he wheezed. "I heard you were the one who found it. Poetic justice, I suppose." There was something unsettling about the old man's tone. Not the defensive denial Mike had expected, but rather a weary acknowledgement, as if he'd been waiting for this day to come. D.A. Winters seized on the comment. "So you do remember the bus, Mr. Morris, and you acknowledge that it was deliberately concealed?" Morris's gaze remained fixed on Mike. "You were just a kid back then, eager, hard-working. Harry said you had potential." He chuckled, the sound dissolving into a raspy cough. "Never imagined you'd be the one to unearth our sins." "Our sins," Carson repeated, stepping forward. "Are you admitting complicity in concealing evidence of the deaths of 13 people, including 12 children?" The old man's expression hardened. "You make it sound so simple, Sheriff. Nothing about that situation was simple." "Then explain it to us," Mike said, unable to contain himself any longer. "Explain how anyone could make the decision to bury children and pretend they were still missing. Do you have any idea what their families have gone through?" A flash of genuine pain crossed Morris's weathered face. "I've thought of nothing else for 30 years. "Yet you never came forward," D.A. Winters pointed out. "Never gave those families closure." Morris sighed, seeming to deflate further into his chair. For a moment, Mike thought he might retreat into silence or claims of failing memory. Instead, the old man gestured to a side table where a crystal decanter stood alongside several glasses. "Pour yourselves a drink, if you like. This isn't a story best told sober." Carson and the DA exchanged glances, but remained standing. Mike, however, found himself moving toward the decanter, suddenly craving the burn of whiskey to steady his nerves. "April 12th, 1988, Morris began, his voice stronger now, as if the act of finally unburdening himself had temporarily restored his vigor. "Harry Jennings called me at home. Unusual for him to bypass proper channels. Said they'd found something during preliminary grading for the expansion project, something I needed to see personally." He paused, eyes distant with memory. It had been the worst winter in decades. Record snowfall, then sudden warming. The spring thaw revealed all kinds of things buried under those drifts. Abandoned cars, dead livestock, hunting cabins crushed by the weight of snow. "But this," his voice faltered. "You went to the site?" Carson prompted. Morris nodded. "Right away. Harry was waiting at the access road. He looked sick, kept saying it couldn't be what it looked like. But it was exactly what it looked like. A roof of a school bus, partially exposed as the snow melted and the ground settled." Mike returned with a glass of whiskey, not offering one to Morris, despite the old man's wistful glance at the amber liquid. The former commissioner continued, his words gaining momentum like a confession too long contained. "The county was on the verge of financial collapse back then. The recession had gutted our tax base. Businesses were leaving. Unemployment was at 20%. The highway expansion was our lifeline, federal funding that would create jobs, improve infrastructure, attract new industry. Delay or cancellation would have been catastrophic. So you prioritize money over human lives," D.A. Winters stated flatly. Morris's eyes flashed with a hint of his former authority. "It wasn't that simple, young woman. We sent men down to investigate. The damage to the front of the bus was catastrophic. The driver, Walter Briggs, was clearly dead on impact. Most of the children, too." Mike's grip tightened on his glass. "Most?" A shadow passed over Morris's face. 2 or 3 had apparently survived initially. They'd moved to the back of the bus, probably trying to escape, but given the storm conditions, the remote location, they couldn't have survived more than a few hours in those temperatures. "You didn't know that for certain," Carson said. "You made an assumption that served your interests." "I made a judgment call based on the evidence available," Morris countered. "By the time we found them, they had been dead for months. Nothing could bring them back. So you buried them," Mike said, his voice thick with disgust, "like garbage beneath a landfill." Morris flinched at the rawness of Mike's assessment. "We discussed other options. Harry wanted to stop construction, report the discovery. Frank Osborne suggested we could extract the bus first, then continue the project. But you overruled them," D.A. Winters concluded. "I made the decision I thought best served the greater good," Morris replied. The community was still reeling from the disappearance. Recovering the bus wouldn't bring those children back, but it would reopen wounds that had only begun to heal. Meanwhile, the economic future of the entire county hung in the balance. Mike slammed his glass down on a nearby table, whiskey sloshing over the rim. "Don't you dare dress this up as some noble sacrifice. You were protecting your political legacy. The highway project was your baby, your path to higher office." A tense silence followed Mike's outburst. Morris stared at him for a long moment before slowly nodding. "There's truth in that accusation," he admitted. "I had senatorial ambitions. The highway was to be my crowning achievement. But believe it or not, I also thought I was sparing those families further pain. By denying them the chance to bury their children?" Carson asked incredulously. "By sparing them the knowledge that some of their children might have survived the initial crash, only to freeze to death while rescue teams searched in the wrong locations," Morris replied. "Or would that knowledge have brought comfort or deeper torment?" The room fell silent as they contemplated this disturbing revelation. Mike felt physically ill imagining those final hours. Children trapped, injured, slowly succumbing to cold and fear while searchers combed areas miles away. The betrayal was even more profound than he'd initially understood. D.A. Winters was the first to regain her composure. "Mr. Morris, how many people knew about this decision?" "Initially, just 4 of us, myself, Harry Jennings, Frank Osborne, and my chief of staff, Richard Hayes." "Hayes?" Mike repeated, recognition dawning. "He went on to become mayor," Morris nodded, "for 3 terms. The highway brought the prosperity we predicted. Millfield transformed from a dying rural community to a thriving suburb. Built on the bodies of children," Carson said quietly. The former commissioner had no response to that brutal truth. Instead, he continued his account. As construction progressed, more people necessarily became aware: heavy equipment operators, foremen, engineers who had to adapt plans to build around the site without disturbing it. "You're saying dozens of people knew?" Mike asked, appalled at the scope of the conspiracy. "By the end, perhaps 20 to 30 key personnel," Morris confirmed. "All sworn to secrecy, all made to understand the consequences of talking, for themselves, for the community, for the families. Most kept the secret, out of a misguided sense of duty. Others were bought with promotions, contracts, considerations, and no one's conscience ever got the better of them." Carson's disgust was evident. Morris's gaze grew distant again. 2 men resigned immediately, refusing to participate. One worker, Joseph Denton, threatened to go public a year after completion. He was found dead in his garage a week later. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Ruled a suicide. The implication hung in the air, too monstrous to address directly. "Are you suggesting Denton's death wasn't suicide?" Winters asked carefully. Morris's expression remained unreadable. I'm saying the secret was protected at all costs. How far certain individuals went to ensure that protection, I can't say with certainty. Mike felt a chill run through him, realizing the rabbit hole went deeper than any of them had imagined. This wasn't just about concealing an accident, it was about a systemic corruption that had potentially extended to silencing whistleblowers. "We'll need names," Carson said. "Everyone involved, their roles, any knowledge of threats or intimidation." Morris nodded wearily. "I've kept records. In the safe behind that painting. The combination is my first wife's birthday, 6/12/34. The DA motioned to a deputy who moved to the indicated painting, a pastoral landscape of Millfield before development. Behind it was a wall safe, just as Morris had described. As the deputy worked the combination, Mike studied Morris's expression. Why keep records if you wanted the secret buried? A ghost of a smile crossed the old man's lips. Insurance, initially. To ensure no one could turn on me without implicating themselves. Later, perhaps I knew this day would come. Perhaps I wanted it to. You could have come forward at any time, Carson pointed out. Could I? Morris's tone was contemplative. Once, the decision was made. There was no going back. The damage was done, lives destroyed. Coming forward would only have multiplied the pain, ruined more families, shattered the community's trust in its institutions, destroyed the prosperity we'd built. That wasn't your decision to make, Mike said firmly. Those families deserved the truth. Before Morris could respond, the deputy succeeded in opening the safe. Inside was a single leather-bound ledger and a USB drive taped to its cover. Everything's there, Morris said. Names, dates, specific actions taken. The digital copy contains scanned documents, memos, altered construction plans, financial records showing payments to certain individuals. DA Winters accepted the items, handing them to an assistant who began photographing each page for immediate documentation. Mr. Morris, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to conceal evidence, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact in 13 deaths. You have the right to remain silent. As the district attorney continued reading him his rights, Morris seemed to shrink further into his chair, the weight of his actions finally made public. His health aide protested weakly about his medical condition, but the old man silenced her with a raised hand. I've lived with this for 30 years, he said, his voice suddenly frail again. I'm ready to face whatever consequences remain in what little time I have left. As deputies made arrangements for Morris's transfer to custody, mindful of his medical needs, Mike stepped outside onto the mansion's veranda. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across the manicured lawn, a jarring contrast to the darkness of the revelations within. His phone vibrated with a message from Darnell, forensic team making new discoveries. You need to get back here. Mike texted a quick acknowledgement, then glanced back at the house where officers were now escorting Morris, blankets still draped over his knees, oxygen tank in tow, toward a specially equipped vehicle. The former commissioner caught Mike's eye as he passed. Pausing briefly, despite the deputy's gentle, the Pineview Motel stood on the outskirts of Millfield, a single-story relic of 1960s roadside Americana that had somehow survived the town's modernization. Its neon sign flickered intermittently in the growing darkness as Mike and Sheriff Carson pulled into the gravel parking lot. Only 3 other vehicles were present: a rusted pickup truck, an economy sedan with out-of-state plates, and a newer model SUV that Mike recognized as belonging to one of Carson's deputies. Jenkins got here 5 minutes ago, Carson said, checking his phone. Says everything's quiet. Ellen Briggs answered the door, confirmed her son is inside. Mike nodded, his mind racing with questions about the Briggs family. Walter had been well-liked in the community, a reliable school bus driver for nearly 15 years before the disappearance. His wife Ellen had faced cruel speculation afterward, with rumors ranging from her husband running off with another woman to more sinister theories about him harming the children. Their son Daniel had been 17 at the time, a high school senior with a reputation for rebelliousness. The family had been fractured by suspicion, and Ellen had left town within months of the disappearance. Now, decades later, mother and son had returned, just as the truth was finally emerging. The timing seemed too significant to be coincidental. Room 14 was at the far end of the motel, partially obscured by an ice machine and vending area. Deputy Jenkins stood outside, his posture alert but casual, maintaining surveillance while trying not to alarm the occupants. "Any movement?" Carson asked quietly as they approached. Jenkins shook his head. "Lights on, voices inside, but no attempts to leave. The woman seemed relieved when I said you were on your way." Carson knocked on the door, 3 measured raps. "Mrs. Briggs, it's Sheriff Carson and Mike Harmon." They heard movement inside, then the door opened to reveal a woman in her late 70s. Ellen Briggs had aged considerably from the photographs Mike remembered from news coverage of the disappearance, but her eyes remained sharp, alert beneath the weariness. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping back to allow them entry. "Daniel's in the bathroom. He's been unwell since hearing about the bus." The motel room was standard budget accommodation, 2 queen beds with faded floral bedspreads, laminate furniture that had seen better days, a small round table with 2 chairs. Near the window, a leather-bound photo album lay open on one of the beds, and various medication bottles were lined up on the nightstand. "Mrs. Briggs," Carson began gently, "you said you have information about what happened the day the bus disappeared." She nodded, lowering herself carefully onto the edge of the bed. "Yes, but it's Daniel's story to tell. I only know what he confessed to me years later. He's carried this burden alone for too long." A toilet flushed, and moments later, the bathroom door opened. Daniel Briggs stepped out, drying his hands on a small motel towel. At 52, he bore little resemblance to the teenage boy from the newspapers. His face was weathered beyond his years, deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes, his hair prematurely grey and thinning. He had his father's height and build, but where Walter had always been photographed with a friendly smile, Daniel's expression was guarded, haunted. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of visitors, then narrowed in resignation. "I wondered when you'd come." "Daniel," his mother said softly, "it's time. You need to tell them." He sank into one of the chairs by the window, his movements suggesting bone-deep exhaustion. "I wanted to come forward when they found the bus. Mum convinced me to wait, to see what the investigation uncovered. And now," Carson prompted. Daniel looked up, meeting their eyes directly for the first time. "Now I need to tell the truth. All of it." "Take your time," Mike said, pulling out the second chair and sitting across from him while Carson remained standing, giving Daniel space while maintaining a position of authority. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. "It started with an argument. Dad and me, that morning before his route, I'd gotten into trouble, vandalism at school, spray-painted some stupid shit on the gym wall. Principal was threatening expulsion. Dad was furious." Ellen interjected. "Walter had warned him about his behavior, said there would be consequences if he got into trouble again." "Yeah," Daniel continued, "and that morning he laid down the law, said I was going to military school after graduation, that he'd already made arrangements. I lost it, said some terrible things, told him I hated him, that I wished he wasn't my father." His voice cracked slightly at the memory. "He just looked at me with this disappointed expression and said, 'Well, I'm still your father, and while you live under my roof, you'll follow my rules.' Then he left for his route." Daniel fell silent, his eyes fixed on his hands. "What happened next?" Carson prompted gently. "I was so angry. Decided to skip school, take Dad's motorcycle out to blow off steam, followed the bus route into the rural part of the county, thinking I might catch up to him, continue the argument. It was starting to snow pretty hard by then. But I didn't care. Mike nodded encouragingly, already sensing where the story was heading. I was on that back road, Wilson Creek Road, when I saw the bus ahead of me. It was moving too fast for the conditions. I remember thinking Dad must still be angry too, driving like that. Daniel paused, swallowing hard. Then I saw it happen. The bus hit a patch of ice on that curve near the old Simmons property. It just skidded, then careened down the embankment. Carson and Mike exchanged glances, both thinking of the forensic evidence that confirmed this account of the crash. I dropped the bike and ran down after it, Daniel continued, his voice now distant, as if he were watching the scene unfold all over again. The front end was crushed against some rocks. I could see Dad through the windshield. There was blood. So much blood! He wasn't moving. Ellen made a small sound of distress from her place on the bed, but Daniel seemed lost in his recollection. I tried the main door, but it was jammed. Went around to the emergency exit at the back, but it was partially buried in snow. I could hear voices inside, kids crying, calling for help. I dug as much as I could with my hands, then tried using a broken branch to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. He looked up suddenly, his eyes filled with desperation. I tried, I swear. I tried to get them out. We believe you, Mike assured him. The forensic team found tool marks on the emergency exit consistent with someone trying to open it from outside. This confirmation seemed to provide Daniel some small relief. I promised them I'd get help, told them to stay together, stay warm. Then I climbed back up to the road to get the motorcycle. But you didn't get help, Carson said, his tone carefully neutral, Daniel's face contorted with shame. I tried to start the bike, but it wouldn't turn over. Must have damaged something when I dropped it. There were no other cars on that back road. The snow was getting heavier. I knew I needed to walk to the nearest house, but that was Miles's place, almost 2 miles away. He paused, drawing a shaky breath. I started walking, but then I realized if I reported the crash, everyone would know I'd been following Dad. They'd blame me for distracting him. And after our fight that morning, people might even think I caused the accident somehow. So you left them there, Carson stated flatly. I told myself I'd think of another way, Daniel protested weakly. Maybe call in an anonymous tip from a payphone in town, but I was scared and confused. By the time I got back to town, the snow was a full-blown blizzard. Schools were closing early, everyone was rushing home. I convinced myself that someone else would notice the bus was missing, that search parties would find them quickly. But they didn't, Mike said quietly, because they were looking in the wrong areas. No one knew the bus had taken Wilson Creek Road. Daniel nodded miserably. Dad sometimes used it as a shortcut in bad weather, but it wasn't part of the official route. I should have told someone. Every day I thought about coming forward, but the longer I waited, the worse it got. Then weeks passed, and I told myself it was too late anyway, that they couldn't have survived the cold. Ellen moved to sit beside her son, placing a weathered hand on his arm. Daniel came home that day behaving strangely. I knew something was wrong, but I thought it was just the fight with his father. When Walter didn't come home, when the reports about the missing bus started, I asked Daniel if he knew anything. He denied it so vehemently that I believed him. When did you learn the truth? Carson asked her. Years later, after we'd moved away. Daniel had a breakdown, ended up in the hospital. He confessed everything to his psychiatrist, who encouraged him to tell me. Her eyes filled with tears. By then, everyone had accepted that Walter and those children were gone. What good would it have done to reveal that my son had withheld information? It wouldn't have brought them back, but it could have given the families closure much sooner, Carson pointed out. They've spent 30 years not knowing what happened to their loved ones. Ellen's expression hardened. And Daniel has spent 30 years tormented by guilt, unable to hold a job, maintain relationships, live a normal life. Hasn't there been enough suffering? Mike interceded before Carson could respond. Daniel, there's something else we need to ask you about. When the construction crews found the bus during the highway expansion, Commissioner Morris claimed that you were there, that you told him the children were already dead. Daniel looked genuinely confused. What? I never spoke to any commissioner. I had no idea they found the bus during construction. You weren't part of the cover-up? Carson pressed. No, I left town right after graduation. Couldn't bear to stay, knowing what I'd done. I've never even been back until now. When Mom called about the news reports, Mike and Carson exchanged significant glances. This directly contradicted Morris's account, suggesting the former commissioner had fabricated Daniel's involvement to bolster his decision to conceal the bus. Why did you come back now? Mike asked. Daniel's expression grew pained. I've been seeing a therapist again recently. We've been discussing the possibility of finally confessing, trying to make amends somehow. When the news broke about the bus being found, it felt like a sign, like the universe forcing me to face what I'd done. He looked at Carson, his shoulders sagging with resignation. I know I'm going to jail. I accept that. Those families deserve justice, and I deserve punishment. But first, I want to go to the site. I want to see them. I need to apologize, even if it's far too late. Carson considered this request, then nodded slowly. We can arrange that. But I need to be clear about something, Daniel. You're facing serious charges: obstruction of justice, failure to report, an accident, possibly negligent homicide, given that your actions potentially contributed to deaths that might have been prevented. You should have legal representation before making any formal statements. I don't want a lawyer, Daniel replied firmly. I don't want to fight this. I just want the truth to finally come out, whatever the consequences. As they prepared to leave the motel room, Ellen gathered her son's medications and the photo album. Mike noticed a familiar face on the open page. Walter Briggs, standing proudly beside his school bus, his arm around a much younger Daniel. The image captured a moment of normal family life, impossible to reconcile with the tragedy that would soon destroy them all. Outside, Carson instructed Deputy Jenkins to escort Daniel and Ellen to the excavation site in a separate vehicle while he and Mike followed behind. What do you make of his story? Carson asked as they walked to their car. You think he's telling the truth about not being involved in the cover-up? Mike considered the question. I believe him. Morris must have lied about Daniel's involvement to strengthen his case for burying the bus. It's easier to justify if you can claim the driver's own son confirmed the victims were beyond help, which means Morris's entire justification was built on a lie, Carson concluded grimly. He never had confirmation that all the children were dead when they found the bus. They might have found evidence that some survived the initial crash. Evidence like Melissa Peterson's diary, Mike added, remembering the heartbreaking entries Dr. Chen had shown him. Morris said they found 2 or 3 survivors in the back of the bus, already dead from exposure. That matches what the forensics team determined. As they pulled out of the motel parking lot, following the deputy's cruiser, Mike's phone rang. Dr. Chen's name appeared on the screen. Dr. Chen, he answered, putting the call on speaker for Carson to hear. We're heading back to the site now. With Daniel Briggs, the bus driver's son. He has information about the crash. That's good, she replied, her voice tense, because we've made another discovery. We've been examining the driver's logbook, which was surprisingly well preserved, inside a waterproof bag. The final entry is quite revealing. What does it say? Carson asked. It's dated December 15th, 1987, the day of the disappearance. Walter Briggs wrote, Route diverted to Wilson Creek Road due to ice on main highway. Daniel following on motorcycle, driving recklessly, trying to get my attention. Need to focus on road conditions. Mike glanced at Carson, whose expression had darkened. So Walter saw his son following him. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. The final line reads, "Road conditions deteriorating rapidly. Daniel just passed. Me, driving erratically, had to swerve to avoid..." And that's where the entry ends, abruptly. The implication hung heavily in the air. Mike looked at the deputy's car ahead of them, now seeing Daniel Briggs in an entirely new light. He didn't just witness the crash, Mike realized aloud. He might have caused it. "He lied to us," Carson said grimly, accelerating to close the distance to the deputy's vehicle. "We need to confront him with this new evidence before he has a chance to alter his story again." As they followed the deputy's cruiser toward the excavation site, Mike wondered how many more layers of deception they would uncover before reaching the full truth of what happened that snowy December day in 1987. The bus had finally been found, but the webs of lies, guilt, and complicity spun over 3 decades were proving even more challenging to excavate. The excavation site glowed under powerful floodlights, transforming night into an artificial day that cast harsh shadows across the exposed yellow bus. As Carson and Mike arrived, Dr. Chen was waiting for them at the security perimeter, tablet in hand, her face drawn with exhaustion from the marathon investigation. Behind her, forensic technicians continued their meticulous work, documenting and collecting evidence from a scene 30 years in the making. "Where's Daniel Briggs?" she asked immediately, scanning the area behind them. "Deputy Jenkins is bringing him and his mother," Carson replied. "They're right behind us." Mike's gaze was drawn to a new development at the site. A white tent had been erected directly beside the excavation, with medical examiners moving respectfully between it and the bus. "You've started removing the remains?" Dr. Chen nodded. "We reached a point where further excavation risked compromising the integrity of the evidence. The ME insisted we begin recovery before proceeding. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Deputy Jenkins's vehicle. As Daniel and Ellen Briggs emerged, Mike was struck by the physical transformation in Daniel's demeanor. His shoulders hunched, his movements hesitant, as if the weight of his approaching confrontation with the past had bent him nearly double. Carson moved swiftly toward them, his expression stern. "Daniel, before we proceed any further, there's new information you need to address." Daniel looked up, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" Dr. Chen stepped forward, holding out her tablet. On the screen was an image of a weathered page, covered in neat handwriting. "This is the final entry from your father's logbook, recovered from the bus. He specifically mentions you passing him on the motorcycle, driving erratically, forcing him to swerve." The blood drained from Daniel's face as his eyes scanned the words. Beside him, Ellen gasped softly, one hand moving to cover her mouth. "You and told us you witnessed the accident," Carson continued, his voice hard. "You didn't mention that you caused it." "I didn't," Daniel began, then stopped, dropping his gaze to the ground. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with tears. "I didn't intend to make him crash. I just wanted him to stop to talk to me." "Tell us exactly what happened," Mike urged, more gently than Carson. "The complete truth this time." Daniel's breathing had become ragged, but he nodded, visibly forcing himself to maintain composure. "I caught up to the bus on Wilson Creek Road. Rode alongside for a while, gesturing for Dad to pull over. He kept shaking his head, pointing to the kids on board, mouthing, 'Not now.'" He paused, struggling to continue. "I got frustrated, decided to cut him off, force him to stop. I accelerated, pulled in front of the bus too sharply. Dad swerved to avoid hitting me, but the road was icy. The bus started sliding toward the embankment." Ellen made a small, wounded sound, and Deputy Jenkins moved closer to support her as she swayed on her feet. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Daniel whispered. "I just wanted to talk to him." "But you didn't get help afterward," Carson pressed. You left those children to die, then spent 30 years hiding your responsibility. Daniel's face contorted with anguish. I tried to open the emergency exit. I heard them inside crying, calling for help. I couldn't get it open and I panicked. I knew it was my fault, knew everyone would blame me. I was 17, scared. His voice trailed off, the inadequacy of these excuses hanging in the night. Dr. Chen, who had been examining Daniel with clinical detachment, addressed Carson. Sheriff, there's something Daniel should see before you continue questioning him. Carson hesitated, then nodded his permission. Dr. Chen led them toward the white tent, stopping at its entrance. We've been piecing together the final moments inside the bus based on the positioning of remains and personal effects. The evidence tells a very specific story. She lifted the tent flap, revealing several tables where the recovered remains were being processed with dignified precision. On a separate table lay artifacts arranged in meticulous order. Backpacks, lunchboxes, notebooks, and various personal items belonging to the victims. Daniel stared, transfixed by the physical evidence of his actions 3 decades earlier. His breathing became shallow, his hands trembling violently at his sides. 7 children survived the initial impact, Dr. Chen explained clinically. They gathered at the rear of the bus, away from the damaged front section. Based on the diary entries and the condition of the remains, they lived for approximately 4 days, attempting to stay warm by huddling together. She picked up a small pink notebook, opening it carefully with gloved hands. Melissa Peterson documented their ordeal. Her final entry mentions hearing someone outside trying to open the emergency door, then hearing a motorcycle drive away. Daniel's legs buckled, and Deputy Jenkins had to catch him to prevent him from collapsing completely. I came back, he whispered. The next day, I came back with tools to try again, but by then the snow had covered everything. I couldn't even find where the bus had gone off the road. For the first time, this new detail rang true. Dr. Chen exchanged glances with Carson, who nodded slightly. The forensic evidence does show multiple attempts to access the emergency exit, Dr. Chen confirmed. Some appear to have been made after additional snow accumulation, consistent with someone returning to the scene. This small validation seemed to give Daniel the strength to continue. I tried 3 times to find them again. The last time, 2 days after the crash, the snow was waist deep. I got lost myself, nearly froze to death searching. When I finally made it home, Mom thought I'd been at a friend's house waiting out the storm. Ellen stepped forward, wrapping a protective arm around her son despite his towering height over her diminutive frame. Daniel was hypothermic when he got home. I thought he'd been foolish playing in the storm. I had no idea. Before Carson could respond, a commotion at the perimeter drew their attention. Margaret Miller had arrived, accompanied by her son Thomas and several other family members of the victims. Their faces registered shock at seeing Daniel Briggs standing near the recovery tent. "That's Walter's boy," Margaret said, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "They said on the news you were back in town." Daniel straightened, visibly steeling. Himself for the confrontation he'd avoided for 30 years. He took a halting step toward the families, then another, eventually closing half the distance between them. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice breaking, "I don't expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but you should know the truth." In the tense silence that followed, Daniel recounted his role in the accident and his failure to report it, omitting nothing, his voice growing steadier as the confession continued. When he finished, the gathered families stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to fury to gut-wrenching grief. Margaret Miller approached him slowly, her movements deliberate despite her age. She stopped directly before him, looking up into the face of the man whose actions had robbed her of her daughter. "For 30 years, she said quietly, I've imagined a monster who took those children, a kidnapper, a murderer, some evil force that stole them away." She paused, studying his face. Instead, it was just a foolish, frightened boy who made a terrible mistake, and then another, and another. Daniel stood motionless, tears streaming unchecked down his face. "I can't forgive you," Margaret continued. "Not today. Maybe not ever. But I understand now. And after 30 years of questions, understanding is something." She turned to Carson. "Sheriff, I'd like to see my daughter now. All of us would like to see our children." As the families were escorted to the recovery area, Daniel remained rooted. In place, watching them go, Mike approached him cautiously. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, his voice hollow. "You'll be formally charged," Mike replied honestly. "But your confession, the evidence that you tried to help, the fact that you came forward voluntarily, all of that will be considered." Carson rejoined them, handcuffs ready. "Daniel Briggs, you're under arrest for negligent homicide, obstruction of justice, and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. You have the right to remain silent." As the sheriff continued the Miranda warning, Mike watched Ellen Briggs's face crumple with grief, though she made no move to interfere with her son's arrest. 30 years of harboring this terrible secret had prepared her for this moment, even as it broke her heart anew. 3 days later, Mike stood at the edge of the now empty excavation site, watching as county workers prepared to refill the massive hole. The bus had been removed piece by piece, the remains recovered and identified through DNA analysis, the evidence collected and catalogued. The physical investigation was complete, though the legal proceedings were just beginning. Former Commissioner Morris had been charged with multiple felonies related to the cover-up, though his attorneys were already arguing that his advanced age and failing health made him unfit to stand trial. Frank Osborne had survived his heart attack and was cooperating fully with prosecutors, along with several other former construction workers who had decided, after 3 decades of silence, that the truth was worth the consequences. Daniel Briggs had been formally arraigned, then released on bail to await trial. His voluntary confession and obvious remorse had swayed the judge, though the charges against him remained serious. The extensive media coverage had made the case a national sensation, with debates raging about justice, forgiveness, and the statute of limitations on both legal and moral culpability. The families of the victims had finally received the closure denied them for 30 years. A memorial service was planned for the following weekend, where 12 children and their driver would at last be properly laid to rest. Darnell approached, clipboard in hand. "Highway Department wants to know if we're resuming construction next week." Mike shook his head. "No, the state's approved a reroute of the expansion. This section of highway will remain as is, with a memorial placed at the site." Darnell nodded approval. "Seems right." As they watched the earth-moving equipment position itself around the excavation, Mike reflected on how a routine highway project had unearthed not just a buried bus, but the tangled web of human frailty, cowardice, guilt, and ultimately, truth. "No," Darnell said thoughtfully. "People keep talking about this like it's the end of something, but for those families, it feels more like a beginning, the start of healing after 30 years of not knowing." Mike nodded, watching as the first loads of earth were deposited back into the excavation. Truth has a way of finding the light, no matter how deeply it's buried. The small town of Millfield would never be the same. The discovery had exposed decades of corruption and conspiracy, tarnished reputations, destroyed the carefully constructed mythology of the community's prosperity. But beneath the pain and recrimination lay the possibility of authentic healing, not the false closure of convenient lies, but the difficult, necessary process of confronting hard truths. As Mike turned to leave, he noticed Margaret Miller standing a short distance away, watching the work. He approached her hesitantly, uncertain of his welcome after all that had happened. "Mrs. Miller, I didn't expect to see you here today." She offered a small, sad smile. "I've spent 30 years wondering where my Emma was. Now that I know, it's hard to stay away." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the excavation slowly fill. "Daniel Briggs came to see me yesterday," Margaret said suddenly. "Asked if he could attend Emma's funeral." Mike raised an eyebrow in surprise. "What did you tell him?" "I said he could stand at the back, not approach the graveside." Her expression was complex, neither forgiving nor vengeful. "He's carrying his own kind of sentence, one that started long before any judge will impose one. I suppose in the end, we're all just looking for peace." With that, she turned and walked slowly toward her waiting car, leaving Mike to consider her words. In the distance, the setting sun cast long shadows across the highway, a roadway built on secrets that could no longer remain buried. The truth had finally emerged from beneath layers of asphalt, earth, and lies, a testament to the fact that no matter how deeply we try to bury our past, eventually it finds its way to the surface. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more powerful true stories that remind us of the complexity of human nature, the enduring search for truth, and the possibility of redemption even after decades of darkness. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important narratives to light, stories that might otherwise remain buried beneath the surface of our shared history.